Howdy, Chess College Humanities. Two, as we course our way through the modern times of painters this week. Um, Hope you all doing well. I was impressed with a lot of your papers last week, but a lot of you aren't handing in papers. And I don't know if you dropped out of the class or whatever reason. I hope you have, because if you haven't, every paper you don't hand in knocks you down a whole full grade. You don't want that to happen. So get your papers in. Contact me. You know how to do that. And you can hand them in on my private email. Late. Late is better than not. Late will get you a couple points at least. Okay. So please get your essays in. Um, I liked a lot of your interpretations of the William Blake poem. It's good. It meant a lot. Thank you for giving us some thought and participating in the course. I hope you're keeping up on your daily journals. We're working our way towards spring break in a couple weeks, and then we're going to do a deep dive into films and movies and modern music. But right now we're in the modern world. Look at chapter 32 in your textbook. It starts covering these modern times, essentially the first half of the 20th century, which a lot of these painters I'm going to talk about today, that's where they existed. Um, Lots was happening in the world, right? Turn of the century, we have the industrial age is on us. Machinery is taking over. We're not farmers anymore. We're industrialists. We're building bridges, starting to build automobiles, starting to build modern machinery like airplanes. And that changed everything. We went from an agricultural society to an industrial society. And the towns like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and Pittsburgh became a hub. They were that way until recently when the auto industry went tanked. Um, and so people were going north to find the jobs. Black people were moving north to have jobs so didn't have to deal with the racist in the South. Jim Crow was still a law in some of the states. Jim Crow it's a term for a law that allowed white people to hang a black person on a minor offense, like looking at a white woman. You could get hung for that. That was on the books until the early 70s, folks. Hard to believe, I know, but um, anyway, so that was blacks, African Americans were not getting a fair shake at all, but they were called to be taxpayers. They were called to join the army. They were called into World War One to go fight, and they did, and they did great. And when they came back, they were treated like crap. And during that era, we had modern movies started. Movie camera was invented by, well, when I talk about movies, we'll talk about it more in detail. By Thomas Edison, of all people, the inventor of the light bulb and the record player and other things. And they started making movies immediately, silent movies. They're just one real movie. They'd be 3 minutes long of a man riding a horse, a boxing match, a man and woman kissing. They were very simple. There was no stories or dialogue. These are silent films, but they had people moving. No one had seen that before. It changed everything. It changed entertainment. When I go into movies, we'll go into that era. But this is happening. Music is changing. It's going from sort of folk tunes passed on through the centuries. Now African Americans are starting to express themselves through the blues and through jazz music. And that was starting to become popular with white people also. And we come out of the World War One into what they call the Roaring Twenties, 1920 to say 29, and things were really hopping. They made booze illegal. It was prohibition, and that didn't stop people from drinking. They had speakeasies, which were private clubs you could be a member of and go drink, but a lot of times you could be arrested for it. The FBI became um, a thing to fight the illegal booze people. That was a big, huge issue of our times. Um, People were still going out and partying like crazy, and women were getting the right to vote in 1919, and they were being free. Women cut their hair. They were no longer bound by Victoria era styles. They didn't want to stay at home. They wanted to have a good time also. They would go to the speakeasies, listen to jazz, drink a cocktail, smoke cigarettes. Women had um, a view of freedom they never had before. And and so the 1920s was a boom time in the United States. People felt good about themselves. Yeah, booze was illegal, but it was still very attainable. So silent movies were a huge thing there. People like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, huge stars because movies became our national pastime in the arts. Um, Sports were thriving in the 1920s. Modern looking baseball was occurring. Football is a lot different than it is today, of course. No face masks, leather helmets, no shoulder pads. Um, anyway, as all this is going on, artists like Pablo Picasso took notice and they were painting the world they saw around them. But they weren't doing a visual image of the world, they were doing what they felt about the world through painting. So his artwork is a reflection on his inner feelings. And that's all these are the artists we're going to talk about tonight. It's the same thing. It became a term known as abstract expressionism because a lot of times there's no figures, there's no trees, there's no still lifes of fruit, there's no recognizable thing, but there is a painting is presented in such a way that gives you an emotion and you can recognize it, adds that emotion. And people looked at Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin for that sort of thing, although Gauguin painted figures mostly. Um, but they were compadres in the early 1900s. As we got further in, immigrants like Ashley Gorky and Willem de Kooning, who came from the Netherlands. Gorky came from Armenia. They came to this country and they studied painting in their home country. And because of Pablo Picasso, they looked at him as a mentor, somebody they could inspire to. They started painting even more inwardly, more abstract. Jackson Pollock painted what they call the drip paintings. He never. Sometimes he wouldn't touch a paintbrush to a canvas. He would drip the paint out of a bucket or on a paintbrush on the ground. Huge paintings of drips, thousands and thousands of drips of paint, and he was expressing his feelings towards the modern world. We'd gone through the wars. Now we're in a Cold War with Russia. The arms race is on. Atomic weapons are being threatened. They still are. And people like Jackson Pollock were painting their illies of what they're seeing in the culture that they lived in. Willem de Kooning, who was from the Netherlands, did the same thing. Um, these guys would paint 12, 15 hours a day. They were obsessed. It wasn't a hobby, it was a calling, a passion. They had to do this. De Kooning painted hundreds of paintings, abstract paintings. I posted a documentary. I hope you will look at it. He's in there. Um, his paintings now sell for millions and millions and millions of dollars, but they sold well in his day. He was a well-known painter. Pollock sold well too, but he was also a well-known alcoholic, and he died young in a car wreck. They don't know if he did it on purpose, but he was out driving, drunker in hell, with two women, and he decided to drive into a tree, killing him and one other woman. To this day, we don't know if it was intentional um, or it was just a simple act of defiance. So there's that tragedy. So many times, tragedies are the aura of tragedy because of people like Vincent van Gogh, who was mentally unstable, maybe schizophrenic, and he went and killed himself over his art because he never sold anything, but he never knew love. He never had a family. He would probably be put on severe medications now. He was in and out of mental institutions, but they didn't treat it like they do now, of course. Um, and so the myth of the suicidal, depressed artist is very well mythologized in the history of painters. William de Kooning and Pollock were world class alcoholics. The alcohol fueled their passion, their desires. Um, as we got into the 1950s, a very quiet, shy man from Pittsburgh named Andrew Warholia moved to New York to become a graphic artist. Changed his name to Andy Warhol um, and became illustrator for fashion magazines and for department stores. And then started looking at the world around him, and he wanted to comment on that world around him. And at the time, it was the height of the Cold War with Russia, the height of very conservative era of our country. Eisenhower was in the White House. Music was changing. Jazz, rock and roll was starting in. Um, TV shows are very conservative. Leave it to Beaver and Father's Knows Best. Those are I Love Lucy were the hits of the day. And Warhol saw something in the American fabric through commercials, TV commercials, ads, and magazines. And that was our obsession with consumerism. So he decided to paint a series of paintings mimicking the Campbell's soup can, and it changed history of art. It was his comment on our obsession with consumerism. it wasn't abstract expressionism. They termed it, it was coined pop art, popular art. And Andy was the man. He knew how to promote himself. He became a huge superstar during all through the 60s. He had a place in New York where he did all his work, had parties called the Factory. Every imaginable popular person, actors, directors, rock stars, Mick Jagger, Jim Morrison, they all partied there. He wanted to branch out and be a filmmaker. So he started making films. He started managing a rock band called the Velvet Underground. He wanted to branch out into all popular forms of art. Um, his movies aren't easy to watch. You can see them on YouTube. He has one movie called Empire State Building, where he shot the Empire State Building in 24 consecutive hours. That's the whole movie. And it's 24 hours long. Um, and in those days, there was no such thing as digital cameras. He did it on 16 millimeter camera, and the rolls, he had 10-minute rolls, maybe 3-minute rolls. That means they have to change the film out every 10 minutes. That's a lot of film. But he did some underground films, Chelsea Girls. A lot of them had lots of nudity, simulated sex. He filmed a naked man sleeping for 8 hours. That's the whole movie, folks. These movies were popular in art galleries, coffee shops. They never were played in movie theaters. Uh, they didn't travel well. It was a New York scene, and it was enough to support it. Then he became famous for being famous, and he's famous for saying, in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. Now, when he said that, it seemed absurd. This is long before the internet, folks, long before TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. But think about it that now. Everybody wants fame for 15 minutes now. Everybody. Look, all you have to do is go on Instagram. How many followers do you have? How long is it going to last? I'm popular. What does this need? I wonder for us to need that. I think it validates us who we are somehow. I'm a filmmaker. I made some movies. They weren't big hits at all. And I was happy when 50 people would show up at the screening. That's 50 people who saw my art. Um, Warhol was tapped into the zeitgeist of the 20th century in our obsession with fame, celebrity through art. Later on, he was shot by a woman who he rejected. He rejected her art, Valerie Solano, who came into the factory and shot him with a handgun. Didn't kill him, but it really destroyed his life. He shot his spleen out. He was in the hospital for months. He never really psychologically recovered from it. Um, he never had security before, but now he moved the factory and they had a ton of security. They didn't want that to happen again. And that means the culture is changing. Now there's anger in the culture. You're famous, I'm not. That pisses me off. I'll show you how to get famous. Maybe I'll shoot you. Just like the guy who shot John Lennon. He didn't hate John Lennon, he loved him. And for 5 minutes, he was bigger than John Lennon. And he took the life of a Beatle. It's hard to imagine now. You guys don't remember, you were too young. But in 1980, I was living in LA as a struggling filmmaker, writing screenplays. When we got the word John Lennon had been shot, we couldn't get our heads around it. He was a pacifist. Give peace a chance. He's one of the Beatles. Who would do such a thing? A monster who wanted his own 15 minutes of fame. He got it. Um, he had to destroy something to achieve his goals. That's the cheap way to do it. Lennon earned it. Warhol earned it. De Kooning earned their accolades. They earned their celebrity through hard work, producing meaningful art, which is not easy to do, folks. Maybe some of you are artists. Maybe some of you are painters. Maybe you're trying to write a play or a novel or a screenplay. It's not easy, but you got to keep going at it. You got to keep wanting it. You got to keep the goal in mind, and don't let anybody say no to you. So then we have um, a woman in this mix, Frida Kahlo. There's not many women artists that are getting fame at all. There's some good artists, but they don't get the accolades the boys do. Frida was Mexican. She was married to Diego Rivera, very fine artist in Mexico, very famous. And She's a free spirit, bisexual woman who slept with men and women, and she was in a horrific accident um, on a bus. She was impaled by a steel s- thing that went all the way through her groin, out her spine. She was in the hospital for months and months, never fully recovered. It wrecked her body. She was always in pain, and she started painting self portraits mostly. I'm going to post a little documentary. Please watch it. They made a movie about her a couple of years ago. They did a good job too. Um, you'll see what she went through, but she got notoriety throughout the world. She came to the United States and toured, but she loved Mexico and she loved the culture. And she dressed in peasant outfits that were no longer popular. They weren't modern dress, but she cultivated this look, a style in her paintings, and she died young of this thing. Finally killed her. It took years for her to die of sepsis or whatever, and um, and she left an indelible mark on the art scene that is as engaging as de Kooning, Pollock. She was painting her pain, absolutely. And there's a beauty in it, a sadness, because you know the story. Early, late 1970s, a young black man named Jean Michael Basquiat came about by he was spraying graffiti on walls in New York City. People noticed it because it was kind of clever. He played in music in a band. He was an outcast because he was black in a white world full of artists and musicians, but he was accepted and he became someone recognized his talent and they gave him some studio space to paint in. And he met Andy Warhol. Warhol became his mentor. This would be in the early 1980s. And Basquiat started selling real paintings for real money, $20,000, $30,000, a lot of money in those days. He was represented by Mary Boone, one of the big art gallery owners in New York. He started selling because the people liked the story. They liked his story, the cultural story. Did that help sell the narrative? Absolutely. Did Warhol's name attach to it? Absolutely. Um, there's a great movie called Basquiat. You should watch it. Came out about 10 years ago, maybe longer, maybe 20 years ago. Jeffrey Wright played Basquiat. He was great in it. Dennis Hopper, David Bowie played Andy Warhol. Anyway, he was a troubled kid. He dabbled in heroin all the time. He lived in New York when New York was affordable. Played in all the nightclubs down there, CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, and the Mud Club. And he was hobnobbing with rock stars and movie stars and other artists. But he had a sad side to him. He didn't want to sell out, but he knew that he was selling a large part because he was black. And there was a competition between him and Warhol. Then his friends started saying Warhol was using him for his own fame. And so he broke up with Warhol. And then Warhol suddenly died at 57 years old. And that broke Basquiat's heart. And within a year, he died of an overdose. Very young man. middle 20s, famous and dead already. You're going to write a paper about one of these artists, so get ready. That's going to be an next essay. I'll sign it tomorrow. On that note, I will see you down the road. Keep up with the reading of the good essays.